In past lectures, we talked about how the United States underwent a transformation in the late 19th century in terms of its foreign policy, i.e., how it interacted with the world abroad. We talked about how during this time, in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, the United States decided to change course, and it no longer focused merely on its own domestic affairs, but rather it started to look abroad. And we saw this in the case of U.S. involvement in the Spanish-American War, which began in 1898. Now, that war, as we talked about, led to a dramatic increase in the size of America's empire. And if you want, you can put empire in quotes because some people dispute whether the United States ever had an empire. But nonetheless, it clearly took on added territory, whether we're talking about the Dominican Republic or the Philippines or any other myriad islands in the Pacific Ocean. After the Spanish-American War, we talked about Theodore Roosevelt, how he ensured that the United States would remain an interventionist power abroad. How did he do that? Well, he did it very soon in his presidency in the early 20th century when he decided that he was going to support the Panamanian rebels in their independence fight. Why? Because with the Panamanians achieving independence, Panama would become its own country, and therefore the United States would get that short piece of land that Theodore Roosevelt was after to create what became known as the Panama Canal. Well, after that, we then talked about how this idea of dollar diplomacy, which was related to the Roosevelt corollary, led to the United States becoming a policeman. So in short, what we're seeing here is by the time we get to the 1910s, when World War I takes place, the United States is now a part of the world. It is interacting with the world more than it had ever done in the past. But I want you to also think about not only what that means for whether the United States is going to get involved in World War I, because it does take some time, 3 years until after the war starts, until the United States actually becomes involved in World War I. But just as importantly, I want you to focus on what comes after World War I, as we will in this lecture and as you will in the documents for this class. Because what we are going to see is we are going to see a very important debate break out in the country, and particularly between Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, and Congress. And that debate is over whether the United States will be an interventionist country, as it had been pretty much since the Spanish-American War, or whether it will return to isolationism. So when we're talking about these two groups, the interventionists versus the isolationists, I want you to use two documents in particular to demonstrate these particular views. Woodrow Wilson is the interventionist. How does he defend continued American involvement abroad? Henry Cabot Lodge is more of an isolationist. He believes the United States should intervene sometimes, but he is against U.S. participation in the League of Nations. So that is the overriding issue that I want to get from this lecture and the corresponding documents. What is America's role going to be in the world? You are going to answer that, especially when we get to the first exam, and try to determine what this debate is all about. Before we get to U.S. involvement in the war, I want to just provide some basic background here, because it is an unlikely beginning that leads to the outbreak of this catastrophic global conflict. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In response, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia in July. Now, this did not have to be the case. During this time in world history, there were a lot of political assassinations, and not all of them led to the outbreak of global wars. But this time was different. And a lot of the problems stemmed from the alliance system that led to one nation declaring war against another, that nation declaring war against that nation's allies, so on and so forth. And I'm going to go through this tricky slope of trying to explain how all of these kind of tit-for-tat alliances led to this outbreak of global war. But for our purposes here, you're simply going to have to understand that there are two alliances, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. But nonetheless, let's talk briefly here about how these two sides came about. So after the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia in July of 1914, Austria-Hungary's ally, Germany, also declared war on Serbia. Germany at the same time would declare war on Russia and France. When Germany overran Belgium and closed in on France, Great Britain, France's ally, declared war on Germany. So simply put, two alliances were formed in the early stages of World War I. The Central Powers included Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Other than that, you had the Allied Powers. The Allied Powers included Britain, France, Russia, Romania, Serbia, Italy, and about 24 other smaller nations. Now, missing from that list of either the Central Powers or the Allied Powers is, of course, the United States. Now, I do want to say this about U.S. neutrality, American neutrality, as we'll talk about in a second, more specifics here. But even before we talk about American neutrality, or perhaps the lack thereof, we maybe can kind of get an understanding of which side the United States is likely going to support. Because if you look at the Central Powers, I mean, even in some of the countries that are part of this alliance, they have empire right in their name. Germany is no different. So therefore, right from the start, you begin to think that even though the United States officially proclaims its neutrality in this war, they are likely going to be on the side of the Allied Powers, who has its traditional relationships with the United States. Particularly Great Britain and France have long-standing relationships with the United States. And moreover, these Allied powers, particularly after Russia will leave the war, after the Russian Revolution, we will see most of the Allied powers have democratic governments. So this is another clue as to which side the United States, even in neutrality, even as a neutral nation, will support in this war. So let's talk about American neutrality, because America had little interest in the growing conflict in World War I in Europe, stating officially its intention to remain neutral. Why? Well, the United States was a nation of immigrants. Americans held no clear-cut allegiances, and you would see this in terms of a couple groups in particular. The Irish Americans. The Irish Americans hated the British. Why? Because the British during this time, and for a long time before this, were occupying their mainland, Ireland. And thus they would support Germany and the Central Powers. So here you have this very large voting bloc, the Irish Americans, who are supporting the Central Powers, the side that the United States likely would not support if it were to become involved in this war. Meanwhile, you also have the German immigrants. They, not surprisingly, supported their mother country, also a member of the Central Powers. But you also have to look at another reason why the United States was reluctant to involve itself in World War I. What you see is Americans. You see a lot of Americans having, particularly American businessmen, having financial interests in Britain. So therefore, they would tend to favor the British side. So in short, the U.S. government, Woodrow Wilson, simply felt that he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't, because you had such a split populace, the businessmen supporting Britain and the Allied powers, but powerful immigrant groups, the Germans and Irish, supporting the Central Powers. Moreover, Wilson in particular was more concerned about what was going on in America's neighbors to the south, in Central America. President Wilson had sent troops to Mexico several years after that nation's revolution in 1910, and U.S. troops were also sent to Haiti in 1915 to quell unrest there. So this stems, if you remember, going back to the Roosevelt Corollary. That is where the United States playground was, if you will. That is where it concerned itself, because it seemed like a more immediate problem than those imperial issues that were plaguing Europeans over on that continent across the Atlantic Ocean. But nonetheless, when it came right down to it, in spite of official American neutrality, meaning that it would not become involved physically in this war, we see a different reality, particularly in terms of finances. What you see is the United States is particularly in favor of supporting the Allies. And we see this in terms of American loans especially. American loans to Britain and France far outnumbered the amount of loans to the Central Powers. And we can see this in pure numbers. Whereas $2.5 billion in loans went to the Allied powers by 1917, only $127 million in loans went to the Central Powers. Moreover, if we look at another financial area, trade, we will see that America continued to trade with Britain, which threatened U.S. neutrality, because part of neutrality is the fact that you will trade with everyone equally. Well, trade to the Central Powers was in fact greatly impacted by the war, going from about $170 million before the conflict to just $1 million in 1916. Therefore, what we are seeing is, again, despite proclamations of official American neutrality, that is not what is really taking place on the ground. The United States is strongly in support of the Allied cause. The Central Powers understood as much, particularly Germany. Therefore, even though the United States was a neutral power, it would face constant abuse from Germany, particularly German U-boats. And this would almost, in 1915, drag the United States into war, just like another explosion of another U.S. naval vessel, i.e. the USS Maine during the Spanish-American War, led the United States into that conflict. So what is going on in the Atlantic Ocean? Well, in February 1915, Germany declared, quote, that all the waters around Great Britain and Ireland, including the whole of the English Channel, is a war zone. This is clearly in reference to continued U.S. trade with the British. Basically, what Germany is saying here is if you are any sort of ship from whatever country, neutral or not, who goes into these waters, you are considered a belligerent in this war, and therefore you are fair game when it comes to being targeted by these German U-boats. So thus we would see German submarines, these U-boats, threatening American trading vessels. And this became a sticky issue and very much and really almost pushed the United States into war. Why? On May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat spotted the Lusitania. Now the Lusitania was actually a British passenger ship, and this British passenger ship was sort of a trick, if you will, because what it also did was, besides shipping passengers between the United States and Great Britain, it was also used to ship arms as well. So therefore, because Germany knew this, the U-boat targeted the Lusitania and torpedoed the vessel. About 1,198 passengers were killed, 94 of them children, and this number, the overall number of 1,198 passengers, included 124 Americans killed. Here we have again appeals for Woodrow Wilson to seek revenge and avenge those American lives lost in the Lusitania. So Americans, though, were divided over how to respond. Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, a guy that we talked about earlier, remember he ran as a populist Democratic candidate in the 1896 election, he would actually resign his position as Secretary of State because he thought it was a mean way to protest the fact that the president, Woodrow Wilson, did not have to force the British to not allow Americans on armed British ships. He wanted to make it illegal for Americans to travel on these British ships because he knew that what happened with the Lusitania would happen, and when it did, there would be increased calls for U.S. intervention in World War I. But despite these misgivings within his own administration, Woodrow Wilson would continually make moves to prepare the United States for war. This was known as the Preparedness Campaign, But yet, Woodrow Wilson was smart enough to know that even as the United States was going to start preparing for war, he could not come out publicly for U.S. involvement in this war because of the strong isolationist sentiment. So therefore, what he did during the 1916 election is he basically said, as his slogan, he kept us out of war. He kept us out of war. Well, this worked. He won re-election in 1916, but things changed the following year in 1917, because despite his campaign promise, Wilson went to Congress in April 1917 to ask for a declaration of war. You, of course, have that document that you're going to be reading for this week. And one of the most important pieces of that speech that I want you to pay attention to is how Woodrow Wilson defended his appeals to go to war. What did he hope to achieve by involving the United States in this war? As a hint, it involves the idea of democracy and the expansion of democracy. So why did Wilson likely want to involve the United States in this conflict? A lot of it had to do, as you'll see in the document, with continued attacks on U.S. trading vessels. There was that fact. But even more so, and again you see this in the document with his talk about democracy, Woodrow Wilson also feared that the United States would be left out of the peace talks when the war eventually came to an end, particularly if Germany and the Central Powers achieved victory. This was very problematical for Woodrow Wilson, who had his own blueprint, who had his own vision for what the future of the world would look like. And in fact, what we're going to see is after Congress approves his declaration of war and the United States enters the war, we will see Woodrow Wilson actually outline his vision for the post-World War I world. After the United States officially entered World War I in 1917, it would be a brief period when they would actually have to fight, and the war would be over in just over a year after U.S. involvement in the war. So American troops did not enter the war until much later. America officially entered the war itself on June 17th and did not arrive on the front until October of 1917. So in short, the war will end in November of 1918, so the United States was just involved in this conflict for about 13 months. But nonetheless, we would see the United States play a pivotal role in turning the tide of what prior to this was a long, drawn-out stalemate between the Allied and Central Powers. And we can see this turnaround in one battle among many, but we're going to focus on one here just in passing. With 500,000 Americans fighting with a similar number of French troops in the Battle of the Argonne in September 1918, the Allied powers were able to reclaim about 200 square miles of French territory. Therefore, this would be the final change of momentum in this war, because what we will see is within 2 months, by November 11th, 1918, Germany would sign an armistice to end World War I. And we can see in the numbers here just how little involvement the United States actually had, because American deaths totaled just 116,516, far smaller than the 908,000 plus lost by the British, the 1.4 million lost by the French, and the 1.8 million Germans lost during World War I. Keep in mind this number that Germany lost, and also keep in mind the fact that when this war ended and when Germany signed the armistice, no foreign troops were on its land. And we're going to come back later to why that is important. But before we get to that, I want to talk about Wilson's vision for the post-war world. What is it going to look like? Well, in the months before the war came to an end, Wilson offered the world his 14 points in January 1918. And I want to talk about some of these more specifically and others just in passing. The first point of the 14 points called for, quote, open covenants openly arrived at. What did this mean? It meant that he wanted an end to these secret treaties between nations that led to these very isolated incidents, like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, extending and expanding into this global conflagration, this global battle that was World War I. The next point called for, quote, absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas. Very simply, he wanted to prevent another Lusitania from happening, which almost brought the United States into this war in 1915. The third point called for, quote, the removal of all economic barriers. Simply put, free trade. We see this idea that America should be involved in the world, not militarily necessarily, but economically. Expansion of international trade was key to Woodrow Wilson's vision for a new world order. The next 9 points were related to demands for self-determination for all nations. Basically an appeal to the European nations that they should end their colonial ambitions and break apart their colonies to again prevent another conflict like World War I from breaking out in the future. Now, the most important point of the 14 points was the last, point 14. This called for the creation of a League of Nations. And we're going to come back to what the League of Nations actually involved and very much the controversy that came about because of this call for a League of Nations. At the end of the conflict, the belligerents signed the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. According to the terms of the treaty, Germany would have to pay the Allied powers reparations totaling $33 billion. Europe itself would be spliced up with a lot of lands being lost by Germany. Germany would lose a ton of lands in addition to have to pay these reparations. So for instance, Czechoslovakia and Poland would become independent countries. In fact, Germany in total lost about 13% of its territory and 1/10 of its population. Now, if you remembered on the last slide, I referred to the fact that Germany lost World War I, but yet not a single foreign troop entered their country. So therefore, think about this from the German perspective. They have to accept guilt for World War I, even though they officially did not start this war. It was a battle between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. Germany went in. Even though they played a part in pushing Austria-Hungary to actually involve itself in this war, Germany was not the only one. But nonetheless, here at the end of the war, they have to accept the blame. But not only that, if that isn't bad enough, they have to pay billions of dollars, and at the same time, they are going to lose all of this money as a result of these reparations, and they're going to lose all this territory. So therefore, what we see arise in Germany is a lot of anger. And this anger will sort of simmer in the background for the next decade or so until we get to the late 1920s and early 1930s, particularly after the start of the Great Depression. And this will eventually lead to the rise of a figure by the name of Adolf Hitler, and then will lead to eventually World War II. So just keep that in the back of your mind, how World War I led directly to World War II. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. So I want to take a step back and I want to look at Woodrow Wilson's point 14. And that was this League of Nations. The League of Nations was essentially, as one historian has described it, an international super parliament. This international super parliament was meant to be a forum for various countries to come together and meet with one another and talk with each other to prevent another outbreak of a global war. Therefore, instead of picking up a gun right away, countries will come to this super parliament and they'll talk it out. Well, opposition to the League of Nations within the United States arose almost immediately. And what you're going to see is you're going to see two groups of opponents to the League of Nations. One of them, Henry Cabot Lodge, who you're going to be reading in this week, his document, offered the most vociferous objections to the League. Lodge was part of a group of 20 senators known as the Reservationists. Now, these reservationists were willing to accept the League of Nations, but they simply wanted some amendments to be made to it, particularly, and you'll see this in your document, particularly as it regarded Article 10. Article 10, and this is an important point here, because like I said, it's going to be referred to in the document. Article 10 stipulated the following, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if any member of the League of Nations was attacked, all other members of the League of Nations would come to that victim nation's defense. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge and his reservationists were very hesitant to support this Article 10. Why? Because according to the U.S. Constitution, the only institution that can declare war for the United States and approve war for the United States is the Congress. League of Nations, it seemed, was taking this power away from a domestic institution like the Congress and moving it to this international body where Americans would lose their say in whether they wanted to go to war or not. Therefore, we have these reservationists who are saying no. Another group who opposed the League of Nations were more forthrightly against the League, and these were about 15 congressmen who refused to ratify the treaty regardless of its form. Many of these were in fact progressives who feared that American membership in the organization would interfere with reform at home. And we saw this a little with the George Norris document that you're reading for this week. He is very much opposed to wasting American treasure abroad for groups that are going to benefit, for a select few who are going to benefit, particularly the wealthy Americans, as you see in that document. Well, in the end, Woodrow Wilson would essentially kill himself trying to get the U.S. Congress to support the League of Nations. He would barnstorm across the country, and in the process he would suffer a stroke and become immobilized. In the end, America did not join the League of Nations, which greatly weakened the organization, even though 58 other sovereign nations signed to join up to the League of Nations. While fighting for the passage, Woodrow Wilson, like I said, would lose the battle not only for the League of Nations, but also for a more interventionist role in the world. And what we're going to see, particularly when we get to World War II, is that for the next 2 decades nearly, the United States will remain an isolationist power. And we'll talk a lot more about that in future lectures.